I wanted to put the interaction problem stuff at the beginning, but I hate this argument. Like, it just makes no sense, and I'm almost angry that it like took me in for so long. Where I'm like, well, of course there's the interaction problem, and I still hear people refer to it like that. Like, oh well, there's this massive problem for dualism. Like, there's just this major issue that just can't be overlooked. It can't be overcome. There's no response to it. So like, we can't be dualist because of that. There's also the hard problem of consciousness, which seems difficult, but it's no interaction problem. It's so frustrating, because whenever I push back on it, I'm like, explain to me, like I'm an idiot, what the interaction problem is. Like, explain to me why I'm supposed to reject dualism because the mind and the body can't interact, probably don't interact. Like, what exactly is the claim here? And then it's kind of this shifting, oh, it violates conservation, oh, causal exclusion, oh, it's just a priori impossible for that to happen. Anyway, it's just, I just don't get it. Like, I don't think it's a good argument at all. But let's do our best to settle the question once and for all, whether there's some kind of devastating interaction problem for dualism. So can you set it up for us? Like, what exactly is the interaction problem as you understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I should say, one landmark event I now remember in my interest in mind-body dualism was as an undergraduate student. I was in a class where the lecturer was talking about, I guess, Cartesian dualism, and he said to the class, "Can anyone think of an objection to this problem?" And waited in deadly silence for a minute, and then he said, "Well, look, the problem is, how would they interact? They can't interact." And I thought about it for a moment, and I raised my hand and said, "Well, why shouldn't they?" And we had this brief sort of back and forth, where I guess I must have come across it before or something, I forget now, but where I was pressing this point, well, I don't see the reason why they can't react just because they're different kinds of thing, different kinds of particle interact with each other. What are the presuppositions here? So yeah, this has been important actually in sort of my thinking about this. The interaction problem is often presented, when you see a broad brush history of the philosophy of mind, as this problem that was raised very early on in response to Descartes' dualism, because it's always Descartes people start with, by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and Pierre Gassendi. And people will often kind of say, and essentially they showed Descartes was wrong, because he couldn't account for mind-body interaction. And that they might say, and people still think now that this is why this theory is no good, glossing over the fact that insofar as it's possible to work out what argument Elizabeth or Pierre Gassendi had in mind, it's very clearly not the line of argument that predominates in contemporary discussions. So that's just not, it's not true as a matter of history of ideas that there is one problem that was raised back then which continues at least to be officially treated as important among the specialists on this issue now. Maybe subconsciously there's the same thing going on. That could kind of be possible. So over the course of the last few hundred years, you actually have a few different versions of the interaction problem being raised, different objections to the idea that an immaterial mind could act on a material body. I think early versions, probably Elizabeth, is presupposing that causation requires physical impact. And if you did think that, then you would have to think that it's going to be hard for an immaterial mind to act on a physical body. But a proponent of that argument would need to defend the, I think, pretty unobvious assumption that causation requires physical impact, especially in the context of modern physics. There's a version that Gilbert Ryle presents in his wildly influential 1949 book, The Concept of Mind, where he says, well, the problem is, according to dualism, everything that happens to a person happens in one of two histories: the history of what goes on in their mind and the history of what goes on respecting their body. But the transactions between these two things belong to neither history, and so they can't occur. That's I mean, maybe that's, in my opinion, like the worst version of this argument. I don't think people often repeat that version. It's just crazy. Like I really think you could say the same, like for the same reason, red billiard balls and yellow billiard balls can't interact causally, because the interactions wouldn't happen in the history of the red ones or in the history of the yellow ones. But the version of this argument that is influential and is officially presented frequently as the reason to not merely to reject, but not even to take dualism seriously, is typically referred to as the causal closure argument. And this is the argument that says, well, we know that all physical occurrences, including those that happen in one's brain, in one's nervous system, in one's body, are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes that go way back into the past, so that everything that happens in your brain, everything that happens in your body, was already going to happen given only the physical causes present operating according to ordinary physical laws. That's kind of premise one. Everything that happens in the physical world brought about by chains of physical causes. And then premise two of this argument says, furthermore, it seems clear that it would be absurd to suppose that those physical occurrences involving your body that are caused by mental events, for example, when my intense phenomenology of desire for wine causes my arm to reach for the wine glass, right? It would be absurd to suppose that that was caused twice over, so that it was already going to happen given only the physical causes present, and by some bizarre cosmic coincidence, my mind or soul also did something which causes the same effect, so that the cause has like the effect has two independent causes, both of which would have been enough to bring it about by themselves. And therefore, we have to conclude, insofar as there are mental occurrences that have physical effects, those mental occurrences must themselves be physical. They must be identical to brain states. They must be brain processes or something like that. Now, and the context of the argument is its proponents assume that we're all going to accept that some mental events really do have physical effects, that my phenomenological desire for the wine really does cause me to reach for it. And so they draw the conclusion, well, at least some of these mental events, some of these conscious experiences must somehow be the same thing as brain states. And therefore, there's no reason to suppose that the mental world in general is not somehow wholly physical. That's the causal closure argument in summary. And there are two ways you could respond to it. A lot of the literature on this argument has focused on responding to that second premise, to the idea that it would be absurd to suppose that the physical effects that we usually suppose to have mental causes are somehow by coincidence caused twice over. So some people will say, E.J. Lowe has said, well, maybe this is fine. Maybe, what does it mean for there to be a coincidence in the laws of nature? Others have said, well, maybe this assumption that some mental occurrences have physical effects is just a mistake, and we should be dualists, but we should be non-interactionist dualists who see the mind's activity as epiphenomenal. It's caused by the physical, but it doesn't have physical effects. Or maybe there's a pre-established harmony, as Leibniz suggested Descartes should have supposed. I don't actually think attacking that second premise is either viable or necessary, because my opinion is that this first premise, this idea that we know that all physical effects are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes, it is just something people have made up, and we would need good evidence that that's the case. So that's my big view, and maybe we can go into some detail, but I don't know. Does that cohere with your take on this problem?
Yeah, no, it's about the same. It's like premise one, interactionism is false. It's like, okay, well, I think this argument might be question begging. And they're like, no, I don't see what you mean by that. But yeah, it's like we don't know why, the things that happen in the brain, like you can just say, well, I think that someday this will all be reduced to, microphysical forces. Like this will all be reducible to, the four fundamental forces, or something like that. Like, just we can give a physical explanation for everything that happens in the brain. There's just nothing left for the soul to do. It's like, okay, are we near that point right now? Like, do you have any kind of reduction? Like, has anyone actually reduced brain activity to like more fundamental physical activity such that we can predict what the brain should be doing if there is only physical
Mhm.
influences and no non-physical influences? It's like, no, absolutely not. We are not within 100 million miles of being able to do that. Like, and I think it's worth pointing out here that, like, because this matters to some people, I don't think it should, but they think that falsifiability is really, really important. And it's like, this is a prediction of dualism, okay? Of interactionist dualism. Like, the for instance, like the predictions of the core theory are not going to pan out in brains. Like the thing that you would
Mhm.
expect to happen, like the way that electrons should behave, just according to the core theory and nothing else, that is not how they will behave in brains. That is a concrete, falsifiable prediction of interactionist substance dualism. It's not dualist's fault that it's hard to test that. Like, it's,
Yeah.
but anyway, we absolutely don't know that everything, like every physical event has a completely sufficient physical cause. And further, the only place that dualists think that this would be happening anyway is in like human brains and body, or just in brains and bodies or something. So sometimes you hear a really lame like inductive argument that like we shouldn't expect anything, like any non-physical influences in the brain, because like, I don't know, when you look at a rock or something, there's no non-physical influences, or when you look in a particle collider, it all behaves according to the laws of physics. But I think you give this example in the book, or maybe it was in a paper I read, of like you're looking in train cars and you're like going along, like, oh, that one's empty, walk down to another one, that one's empty. And it's like, well, then all the rest of these are empty because I've checked like a few of them. So inductively, I should suppose that these are all empty. It's like, that is a bad argument. There might be people in one of the, yeah. Anyway, it's just it's a very, very
So
bad argument.
what I want to say about this is, yeah, there are two ways that people try to defend that premise, if they try to at all, which they certainly don't always do. And one way is by appealing to what we know about the um, mechanics of inanimate matter outside of the nervous system. And then the other way is by appealing to what we putatively know about the mechanics of the matter inside the nervous system. Two ways of backing up that premise. And I think neither of these is at all persuasive. I mean, they're worse than not persuasive, they're laughable.
Mhm.
Although put forward by people who are otherwise, typically very brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, that's what's so
So,
weird about
so
it.
the first of these I want to say is, this is an example of what's known as the streetlight effect or the streetlight fallacy. So the joke is, a policeman encounters a drunk searching around under a street lamp. When I was first told this, I was in Cambridge and the drunk was Wittgenstein, but I don't think that's original to that a joke. But he asks what he's doing, and the drunk says, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." So the policeman starts looking with him, and after half an hour, he says, "Are you sure this is where you dropped your keys, sir?" And the drunk replies, "No, I dropped them over there, but it's too dark to search over there." Now, what that illustrates is that if you have independent reason to think a phenomenon will occur in one place, in place A, but not in place B, then to gather evidence as to whether it exists or not, you've got to look in place A and not in place B. Essentially, that's what it boils down to. So whenever people try to back up the causal closure principle, this idea that all physical effects are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes, by appealing to what we know about the mechanics of inanimate matter, it seems to me they're very clearly guilty of the streetlight fallacy. Dualism does not predict that the particles in the Large Hadron Collider are not going to behave in accordance with the standard theory. On the contrary, it predicts they probably will, right? Now, I don't want to go too hard on people who adopt this line of argument, because I think it is right that if you are antecedently committed to a wider philosophical methodology, a wider philosophical starting point of the right sort, you might then be rational in drawing the inductive inference from inanimate matter to animate matter. So, for example, suppose you're committed to the view that we should only accept evidence that is verifiable by third-person observation. So you're not. So I'm methodologically committed to the view that first-person awareness of one's conscious experiences doesn't count for building a worldview for whatever reason. Then I might very reasonably say, well, the fact that we haven't noticed any occurrences in matter that don't adhere to standard theory, at least at the relevant scales, does give me good inductive evidence to think the same is true of the nervous system. But of course, if that's your line of reasoning, and I think implicitly, like when Sean Carroll, for example, presents this version of the argument, he does seem to be doing something like this. If that's your line of reasoning, well, what you have is not a refutation of interactionist dualism on the basis of physical observations. Rather, what you have is a prior philosophical commitment to ignore the kind of evidence that interactionist dualists are going to be basing their view on. And if you can then show, like, yeah, actually you do have to dismiss this first person awareness of your own conscious experience. If you can prove that, then you'd be home and dry. But the focus is going to be on that really controversial move that sets everything up in favor of physicalism and the issues about the causal structure of the cosmos aren't doing the work. There is a different way of trying to support this argument, though, which doesn't base it on what's going on in inanimate matter. And I actually think, like, physicalists who are specialists on the mind-body stuff tend to be well aware, tend to be willing to acknowledge that physics, insofar as it's based on observation of inanimate matter under heavily controlled conditions, isn't going to, or idealizations of animate matter like spherical cows, isn't going to give us the evidence we need. And the most cited work, I think, on this is surely that by David Papineau, who I really like his work on this for a number of reasons. One is that Papineau is very open about his own thought process, and he states that he had taken it for granted that, of course, causal closure is something we know because of physics. He had personally arrived at that, the conclusion that this is a good reason to be a materialist on the basis of that assumption. However, after puzzling over it for a long time, he came to the conclusion that no, the evidence from physics isn't going to do this. Sure, interactionist dualism predicts that there are going to be events in the nervous system in the brain that you wouldn't expect on the basis of the physical laws governing inanimate matter alone. You would expect things to happen that aren't predicted by the four fundamental physical forces. But it's then an empirical matter whether that occurs or not. And Papineau, very, very much to his credit, is totally open about that. What I find interesting here is that physicalists who have read up on this stuff, very frequently will refer to Papineau's exposition of the causal closure argument as the gold standard version, which is kind of deserved on the grounds I've just outlined. However, Papineau continues to endorse the argument strongly. He says that we need to endorse it, we ought to endorse it on the basis of the biological evidence. And So when I was first thinking about this, I really wanted to know, well, what exactly is this biological evidence? And the funny thing is, there are really 3 papers, or 2 papers in 1 chapter, I think, where Papineau presents all this material. And 90% of it is actually focused on explaining why the evidence from physics, including concerning conservation of energy, and so on, isn't going to give us good grounds to accept the causal closure principle when it comes to the nervous systems of animate beings. And only very, very briefly does he explain why he thinks the biological evidence does support that principle. In fact, really, he gives some sort of broad context about the progress of biology. He talks about Darwin, DNA, that kind of stuff. But you really just get this one sentence where Papineau then says, well, it was really in the 1950s and 1960s that it's something like biologists, they mapped the neuronal network of the nervous system and measured the electrical activity of the brain. And in his words, this clinched the case in favor of physicalism. This resulted in the clear-cut case for causal closure in the nervous system. And that's why Papineau conjectures, as a matter of history of ideas, that was the time when physicalism became the dominant position. Now, I think it's really useful that Papineau, thinks about, well, when did people start becoming predominantly physicalists, specialists on this stuff, and what could have been the scientific discoveries that would have vindicated that move at that time. But all he gives us is that one sentence, which doesn't cite any study. It doesn't mention any particular experiment. There are no details about the findings. And I kind of think that, like, the entire physicalist consensus that predominates in contemporary, discussions of the mind-body issue is like this enormous upturned pyramid balancing on that one sentence in Papineau's writing. So I've spent some time thinking about, like, what could in the 1950s and 60s have justified this belief that all physical effects in the nervous system are brought about by chains of sufficient physical causes. And I think it's really clear that the main contenders are not up to the job. So Papineau mentions the mapping of the neuronal network. But I mean, to a modern reader like that, it sounds like he's talking about the project of mapping the connectome, the synaptic connections between all the neurons in an animal's brain. But that project didn't really start till the 1970s. And at the time Papineau's writing, they'd only done it for the 200 neuron brain of the microscopic worm C. elegans. Last year, they managed it with the brain of a fruit fly. That's super impressive, amazing stuff. You can see it online. It's really cool. But definitely in the 50s and 60s, they hadn't done that. And anyway, the connectome only gives a static structure. It doesn't tell us about dynamic functioning. So it's not going to tell us whether causal closure is true or not. Something else that happened, which I think Papineau might be alluding to, is in around the 50s and 60s, Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley produced their model of ion flows across the neuronal membrane. And this is like this very impressive, essentially physical model of how a neuron operates. However, they got the Nobel Prize for that work, so really important advance. But they were basing that on an isolated giant neuron of a squid, not a neuron situated in a living brain. And they, as they emphasize in their work on this, dualism or no dualism, you would expect to observe very different functioning in a neuron in a living brain. And actually in the 50s and 60s, the most precise method for imaging a live brain was electroencephalography, which had at that time a resolution of a few centimeters squared, or sorry, like that's like also a few inches squared, or cubed. It's basically two-dimensional. It's not really even cubed. But this is like looking at the electrical activity averaged out of hundreds of thousands of neurons at a time. So none of that is anywhere near close enough, it seems to me. I mean, maybe I haven't found it yet, but none of that seems close enough, anywhere near close enough to provide good reason for believing in a causal closure in the nervous systems of animate beings. And there's this further problem that actually it's not really true that the immaterial mind or soul was rejected towards the end of the 50s and 60s. Already the core, the major shift happened by or at the point of Ryle's 1949, the concept of mind. So I don't know. I could say more about this. Like I tried looking up like what were the views of the leading neuroscientists at this time on the mind-body problem. And the funny thing is, like, if you look at those who map the nervous system in the first half of the 20th century, you get like Charles Sherrington and Wilder Penfield are the only ones who had outspoken views on this issue, and they're notoriously sympathetic to dualism. The Nobel Prize winners in neuroscience in the 50s and 60s, there's only about 8 of them, 4 Nobel Prizes between 8, I think. The only one with whose views on the mind-body problem I could find is John Eccles, again, notoriously sympathetic to dualism. So I think Papineau's, done a service in putting forward this historical story as the most plausible story which would be needed to vindicate the physicalist consensus. But so far as I can tell, what it actually gives us is a genealogical critique of physicalism. We can see pretty clearly, I think, that physicalism did not arise because people had good reasons to be physicalists of the sort that get put forward by proponents of the view these days. Maybe there are other good reasons, but the actual explanation for the consensus that exists does not seem to consist in those.
Yeah, if there are good reasons to accept physicalism, I would love to hear them because I've not heard any yet. I was actually I was just thinking about this.
Well, you're inviting the wrong people onto your podcast in that case.
Yeah,
Need someone else.
I mean, like it seems like what you just described happens, anywhere you look at physicalism or like the history of the acceptance of physicalism. It's like, why did this become widespread? Why did people start accepting this? Like, how did this become like the kind of narrowly majority view in philosophy like it is right now? Because there aren't really arguments for physicalism. Like the there are a few things you can point to. I mean, physicalists will say things to you if you ask for evidence for their view, but it consists mostly in bringing up correlations. Like, well, if I hit you in the head, you will think differently, and just like an infinite variation of if I change your brain, your mind will be different, as a consequence.
I like
which
to say that
is,
you can, by this reasoning, you can use the correlation between the movement of the tides and the moon to prove that there's no moon.
That's a great point. Yeah, actually, there is no moon now that I think about it. Or the moon and the tides are identical. They're the same thing.
That's the other option. Yeah,
it's like heat and kinetic motion. Like this is just standard science. The moon and the tides are the same thing.
that's right.
Yeah, it's just so weird because it seems like the causal interpretation is just as legitimate, like, philosophically, scientifically, whatever. Like if you're going to look at all these correlations and say, oh, evidence for physicalism, it's like, well, strictly speaking, I think it's evidence for monism, which physicalism is not the only variety, but it's not as if dualists predict that you can do anything to the body and then nothing will happen to the mind. Like when has that ever been a part of the dualist view? Like it's not like some kind of ad hoc addition, same thing with the strong emergence stuff you were mentioning. It's like it's never been a part of the dualist view that you should expect microphysical systems to behave differently when they're like not a part of a brain or something. But yeah, it just seems like perfectly legitimate to say, well, maybe there's some kind of causal relationship between the mind and the brain, and the brain and the mind. And that's why there are correlations. And you might say, oh, well, that's too complex. It's not the simpler explanation. First of all, like you said, there are kind of other cases in nature where you can point to A and B being connected in some way, and it would seem totally ridiculous to say that they're identical. And you might think this is one of those cases because mind and body don't seem like the same thing, first of all, and you have to do a lot of philosophical heavy lifting to even make it possible that they even could be the same thing. And I don't
Yeah,
know.
the problem is that it's logically incoherent that they should be the same thing.
That's
That's
another
the
problem.
difficulty with that.
Yeah. But anyway, the reasons to be a physicalist are like few and far between. It's actually interesting how little there is going for it and how much there is going against it.
Add just two things to that. One thing I think is worth adding is that this idea of causal closure that people seem so ready to accept, throwing out of the window any demand for like detailed empirical evidence of the kind that they would presumably adhere to in other contexts. That idea is not new, right? Pierre-Simon Laplace was insisting that we know that all physical effects are brought about by sufficient chains of physical causes back in I think 1814, and Leibniz was saying the same thing back in around 1714, 100 years before. And we have pretty good evidence that Democritus was saying the same thing back in 550 BC. So I think we've got good evidence that this is something people are pretty good at arguing themselves into believing in, when we all agree they do not have good empirical evidence for it. And so there's a pretty plausible case of thinking that might be what contemporary proponents of this view have done. I also just wanted to add that you said you thought the causal closure arguments question begging, and that often irritates its proponents, who will say, no, it's not question begging because the causal closure principle is consistent with dualism. It could be the case that non-interactionist dualism is true, or it could be the case that interactionist dualism is true, but that there's this coincidence whereby the mind always causes effects that were going to happen anyway, given what's going on in the body. And I think what one should acknowledge, there is a sense in which that's right, that it's not strictly question begging. At the same time, I think that there is a deeper sense in which it is question begging. And that's because I think an argument is question begging where your grounds for accepting one of the premises include either the conclusion, your acceptance of the conclusion, or your acceptance of something that independently motivates that conclusion. And I think the grounds proponents of causal closure argument have for accepting the causal closure principle, if they have them, if they're not merely making stuff up, are inevitably going to involve a commitment to a kind of methodological naturalism that dismisses first-person awareness of one's mind at the outset, and that therefore leads independently to a rejection of dualism. So I think you're right when you say that, but more you're right in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I was about to say, so it turns out I was right for reasons I didn't even understand when I said that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there could be non-interactionism or epiphenomenalism or systematic overdetermination. So strictly speaking, that's not question begging. But yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Back to the interaction problem, though. Actually, back to Elizabeth, because I do kind of want to psychoanalyze some of the interaction problem people a little bit, because I think that the idea that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia debunked Descartes, I think that's appealing to modern audiences in certain ways, because they like this narrative about a brilliant woman who showed up this arrogant man who's been, unjustly remembered by history. And this woman's been forgotten, even though she was right and he was wrong. And that's a story that a lot of people like, I think. And it doesn't matter to them. I mean, I can prove actually that it doesn't matter to them that she was a disciple of Descartes, that as far as I know, she remained a dualist. She didn't reject dualism on this basis, as far as I know. I don't think she became a materialist after writing those letters. And as you're pointing out, her objection plays zero role in the contemporary debates on the interaction problem, since no one thinks causation requires physical contact. So like you can kind of see what her problem was with it, but no one no one in physics thinks that like, oh yeah, in order for causation to make any sense, there has to be physical contact. It's just people just refer to her, I think, for reasons of like narrative. They just like the story.
I think that's totally true. And there are contexts in which it's fine to tell you can never be wholly truthful in every possible detail, or you often have to balance that with giving a picture that gets across the core message. So I think this is sort of acceptable. I mean, I would campaign that we should admit that Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia didn't refute Descartes, but to balance that out, we should declare that Hilary Putnam is indeed a woman, as all undergraduate students presume on the basis of her name, and that will sort of balance the reading this in those respects. The thing is, people have found some pretty tenuous ways to weave, anti-dualism into a sort of liberal political narrative or something, whereas they leave untouched the really great arguments or ways in which you might do the opposite, right? You might have Gregory of Nyssa, the only person in the ancient world to oppose slavery, doing so on the basis, in part, of his essentially Christian Platonic mind-body dualism. But yeah, you can do this kind of thing in both directions, and I discussed this a bit in the start of the book.
Yeah, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. I wonder what else he was right about. People should look into that. Anyway, the last thing about interaction I wanted to bring up was conservation of energy. There's like a because actually it was David Papineau who helped me see that mind-body interaction would not violate conservation of energy. But there was a philosophy professor on Twitter the other day who I was arguing with who brought up the kind of like core theory based interaction problem where it's sort of causal exclusion. I can't really tell, but he's like, oh, he's basically affirming something that sounded like micro-reductionism to me, where it's like, okay, we know how atoms behave. They're going to behave the same way in your brain as they do, in a microphysical system. So there's nothing left for the mental stuff to do. That's why it's bad, or so that's why you got to reject interaction. And then I pointed out that the experiments he's citing don't demonstrate the idea that particles are going to behave the same way. It doesn't demonstrate micro-reductionism. And then he's like, oh, well, that was never the point. The point was conservation of energy, actually. And I pointed out that it doesn't violate conservation of energy, and that David Papineau helped me see this, and then he stopped replying to me. But anyway, it was like you're not going to violate conservation by introducing a different basic force. Like conservation doesn't say how many fundamental forces there are, or which ones there are. It just says that whatever they are, the total amount of energy is the same. Like if we add a new force, it just has to pay back everything that it takes, and vice versa. But as long as energy is conserved, like as long as the total amount of energy is the same, then it's not like Maxwell was violating conservation when he introduced a new fundamental force. Like you don't violate conservation just by expanding the inventory, and no one thinks physics is done anyway, so it seems like kind of a dumb point. Like, yeah, we could add another force of nature. Like there's mental causation. There's a non-physical substance. It's a force of nature just like anything else. And it only kicks in higher levels of organization and complexity, but that doesn't violate conservation. We're not, it's not like there's new energy being fed in, that just is coming out of nowhere ex nihilo or something.
I actually want to. I would prefer to say something slightly. I mean, I think I would want to agree with everything you say, but I would want to put the emphasis elsewhere. Conservation of energy as a thesis about the physical forces we know about, leaving aside the respects in which physics is an ongoing project, is a claim about what happens in a physical system without any influence from the outside. Total amount of energy is conserved, and it's conserved locally, and this reduces ultimately to certain symmetries in the physical theory. I just want to say, sure, well, it's not going to disobey that, because dualism posits an influence from the outside, and I'm sympathetic to the hypothesis that maybe this new force will adhere to a wider conservation of energy principle that includes what's going on when the new force is introduced. But I don't actually think one needs to worry about that. It's an empirical matter whether that's the case, so far as I can tell. We could make observations that back up the hypothesis that actually souls are energy sinks. Energy goes in, but so far as we can tell, it doesn't always get paid back. Fine. If our observations suggest that would be totally, there's no logical contradiction in that hypothesis. We could make observations that seem to suggest that souls are energy seams, and that they're actually releasing new energy into the world. Again, it seems to me pretty clear that we could make observations which would make that the most elegant hypothesis once we balanced out the various systems of physical or psychophysical laws we could posit. And this is just an empirical matter. And one shouldn't allow someone to cow one with the idea, well, no, conservation of energy, wave it like a magic wand, as if it can refute claims about parts of reality that we haven't made the relevant observations about. And I would want to name check here the really excellent work by Brian Pitts, who's a trained philosopher and physicist, who's written about this in real detail, going into the mathematics. I mean, far more deeply into the mathematics than proponents of the causal closure argument tend to go, looking into this issue. And he even presents a toy model of how you might have an additional force acting in a way that would violate conservation of energy, but in a way that's non-contradictory. It's an empirical matter whether it ever happens or not. And actually, he's worked a bit with another guy, Alan Christoph Cuckoo, who's done some great work on this too, looking more at the biological side. Cuckoo has this a really interesting paper just saying, well, if from an uncommitted view you look at what's going on in the brain, would you come away saying we can explain everything that goes on here? And he says, actually, no. The initial surges of activity that occur at the start of free action look pretty weird. It's not clear how they come about. So he goes through some theories of how they might. I mean, I think there's loads more work to be done on that, but it's throwing down a gauntlet in a way that I think it has the boldness that we're going to need if we're going to make progress on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people make a lot of assumptions about what neuroscience looks like and like what's actually been shown or what's actually been done. But yeah, it's a lot more ambiguous. Even it could even come to vindicate substance dualism, not just like be consistent with it.
But I think that's Cuckoo's idea. The paper's called "Turning the Tables" or something, or one of them is. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunate name for arguing for something like that, but yeah. I think he's probably heard that joke a bajillion times. Sorry, but anyway, it ultimately is going to be an empirical question whether souls are energy sinks or the converse. But I'm just arguing against the claim I hear sometimes, like necessarily, substance dualism is going to violate conservation or whatever. And it's like, no, it's not. It does not necessarily violate conservation, even though, as you're saying, we shouldn't be married to the idea that it definitely doesn't. It might, but yeah, it's definitely not the case though.
It certainly doesn't violate any conceivable conservation principle. And I mean, if you wanted to say it's a real problem, it violates it, you'd need an a priori principle, given that we don't have the direct evidence.
Yeah,
I think there might be such a thing. Actually, maybe I shouldn't go into this. I feel like there might be something a bit like an a priori conservation of energy principle that you could derive from the scholastic axiom that nothing comes from nothing. And I feel like that's in the background to all of this, but maybe that's the topic.